And we're back. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Global Tantrum. I'm your host, Steve Pally. With me, as always, is my co-host, Professor Galen Jackson. Galen, how you doing, man? I understand that you are a new uncle, right?
Well, an uncle another time over, I guess.
Yes, a
Yeah,
repeat uncle, if you prefer.
yeah. Yeah, being an uncle is awesome, man, but I understand how the rest of you do it all the time.
Because we have to. What choice do we have?
Like there was for the most part, I was helping out my sister last week, which is why we were off.
Right.
We had like a 4 adult to 2 child ratio, which
That's a great
is
ratio.
a great ratio, is my understanding. And I made it like 6 days and was like, all
Tapping out.
right, that's
All
uh
good.
that's 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 the best I've got in me, man.
Well, good on you for even doing 6 days. Our ratio is 2 to 2, and we consider that getting ratioed, like
Yeah,
YouTube
yeah.
style. That's the wrong ratio, but so many people have ratios like that, or even worse. And how
Here's
do you do?
here's the difference. You're doing it for like forever.
Yeah, yeah. Well, 18 years, right? To to quote Kanye, which I guess we shouldn't do anymore.
Yeah, yeah.
Anyway, speaking of getting ratioed, we're going to talk about some weapons and casualty ratios over in Ukraine, Eastern Europe. We're back to Ukraine this week,
Just an
right?
amazing segue by you.
You know, I am getting better with practice. Yeah, ratios in Ukraine are not looking favorable for the Ukrainians. We do have a 1-to-1 ratio in prisoner exchanges,
Yeah.
right, Galen? So that's one piece of news out of Ukraine. Can you tell us about that?
So Russia and Ukraine are holding their first direct talks since the early months of the war. So
Right.
in just about 3 years, I think they're being held in Istanbul. My understanding is, yeah, it was 1,000 Russians for 1,000 Ukrainians. I think they've implemented about 400 of them on each side. I have not seen any analysis that this is part of any larger political deal, but it's possible. I think we're going to talk about reasons for skepticism about why it might be part of a larger process, but sometimes this is how diplomacy starts, with sort of these confidence building measures and lower level exchanges. So it's possible something bigger's in the works, but I think we both are skeptical that anything's going to lead to a breakthrough imminently.
Got it. Now, if I'm remembering correctly, there was talk of a 30-day ceasefire. Trump was behind it at one point. Zelensky was excited and he was like, we're ready to do it right now, but we actually need a ceasefire. Trump then talked to Putin. All of this going down in the last week to 10 days, something like that.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
And Trump now seems to have backed away from it, remarking, this is a European issue. It always should have been. So it's kind of unclear where the United States stands
Well,
as
I
far as
think
this
it's
goes.
clear what led to that.
Okay,
Which
can you talk
and
about that a little bit?
yeah, and I want to be very clear. I think it was worth doing, which
Mm,
puts me at odds with a fair number of people probably. But I think it was worth investigating whether some sort of settlement was possible. And I think Zelensky played his cards quite well. Now, maybe that's because he didn't have a choice after the now infamous meeting at the White House, whenever that was, back in March or February.
March.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um, but Zelensky basically said, yeah, okay, we're open to a ceasefire and to maybe looking at some serious negotiations. And Putin said no, which apparently Trump wasn't expecting. And he doesn't seem to have a great backup plan, because I don't think he's interested in resourcing this war effort anymore. So Putin presumably knew that, and for reasons we'll talk about, might think that he's got the upper hand if the United States indeed chooses to reduce its role in prosecuting this war. So Putin said, my counteroffer is no, and Trump was like, ah.
Well then. So this is interesting. So Trump could have said, we will continue to support the Ukrainians then. He could have said, we will increase support to Ukraine. He could have said, we will make sanctions worse and do secondary sanctions and screw with their banking sector. There are levers to pull. And Trump has actually said all of those things in the past, kind of in passing as threats, right? And in fact, I believe that the Senate is sitting on a major, major escalation of sanctions towards Russia. They're sitting on a package that's basically ready to pass. Lindsey Graham has talked about it. Should the president decide to reach for this tool, it's ready. But he's not doing that. He talked to Putin one-on-one for, I think, 2 hours and came out of that conversation basically being like, I'm not going to do any of that, right?
Yeah, so, I mean, I actually didn't know about the Senate sanctions package, so I'd have to look into it. Look, he's made some indications in the last, call it 2 weeks, that he's at least thinking about the possibility of now that his carrot was rejected, reaching for some sort of stick. Now,
for the first time,
I'm not really sure how big a stick that's going to be based on everything he has said in the past, and everything I seem to think indicates that he does not want to keep doing this. And I believe the package that was passed by Biden that has something like $10 billion left in aid to it is set to expire in the next couple of months, I think by the summer. So basically, I mean, you can tell me if you think this is right, but it would appear Trump has like two choices here, which is just wash his hands of it, and that's probably where I would put my money, or look to regain some leverage to set up negotiations with Russia by doubling down on what has been the policy for the past few years, which is providing a lot of support to Ukraine. I don't see a ton of other options for him beyond that.
Yeah, those are the two things he can do. He can go forwards or backwards, more or less. And he has professed a desire to reset relations with Russia. If he were to go forwards against Russia, that would obviously become impossible. And he seems to value the relationship with Russia, or the potential relationship with Russia, more than he does the prospect of a free Ukraine and a secure Europe. And he has, I don't know if he's said as much. He's certainly hinted at it and beaten around the bush. But I mean, we can take a look at what he's actually done, right? Words are one thing, and then there's actions. And as you said, like, you know, he's made some half-hearted attempts to get the Russians to the table, but he hasn't done anything more than made threats that, at least to this point, have been empty threats against Putin and the Russians.
I kind of think, and I'm speculating a bit here, but having looked at quite a bit of the news analysis on this, like, there's an article in the most recent issue of Foreign Affairs by A. Wes Mitchell, who I can't remember if he was in the Pentagon or the State Department during Trump's first term, which basically outlined not quite a spheres of influence piece, but like he makes the case for what he calls strategic diplomacy, which is basically like, this isn't 1995 anymore. The U.S. can't just go around doing whatever the hell it wants. It kind of needs a reprieve to rebuild its military base, its economic base, deal with some domestic problems. So it should cut some deals with China and Russia in the short term with the goal of being stronger in, say, a decade from now. And so I'm not sure that's a accurate proxy of what the administration's approach is, but it sounded roughly right to me that he's looking to cut some deals, including with Russia. And I think he assumed, since the peace plan that I think he's looking to implement would be, by most accounts, fairly favorable to the Russians, allowing them to annex a fair amount of Ukrainian territory. And I think he was just surprised that Putin said no to that, because Putin thinks time is on his side. And I don't know if he has a plan B.
Right. The plan B seems to be washing his hands of it.
Yeah.
Because it's hard and he's got other stuff to do, and he's not interested. I believe he's sincere in his desire to stop the fighting.
I do too. Yeah.
Yeah. It's just a question of like what he will have to do, what he'll have to put up in order to make that happen. and he seems disinterested. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know if more arms are going to go to Ukraine. Let's, for the purposes of this discussion, though, assume that the United States is out. There's not going to be more American aid coming to Ukraine. Where does that leave Ukraine?
Well, that is the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
There seems to be some pretty significant disagreements about that, which, or maybe I should phrase it this way. I would say the preponderance of the analysis I've looked at says it leaves Ukraine in not a great position.
Would you say it's up shit creek?
I would
no
say
paddle?
I would say that seems to be what the consensus is.
Got it.
And the United States has supplied about half of the roughly 130 to 140 billion dollars in military aid that Ukraine has received since the Russian invasion in February 2022. It is possible that the Europeans, particularly the bigger European states, Germany, France, Britain, could make up a decent chunk of the shortfall if the United States pulls out. They also, Germany just announced that it was moving a number of sophisticated U.S. weapons systems to Ukraine. It needed U.S. approval to do that, but the United States approved that. So it's not as if the Europeans have no options or no capability to replace the United States. The concern is something like this. One, the United States is a much bigger power than any of the European states are, which we've talked about before. So just in sheer financial terms, it's going to be a serious burden. But the bigger point is, while the Europeans have military equipment, it's the United States that supplies almost all of the most sophisticated stuff, and especially things like air defense missiles. And so if you remove the United States from the equation, those are not weapon systems that can be easily produced without long-term defense contracts. Training new soldiers on them can take quite a bit of time. There's a concern that well predates even the Russian invasion, but a concern that the Europeans don't have the unity or the same threat perception of Russia. And so balancing might not be super efficient. So those are the concerns, and I think the prevailing wisdom is if the United States gets out of the arming Ukraine business, their days are numbered, and things could look pretty serious even within a span of something like 6 months.
Got it. That's the consensus. I have a number of questions about that consensus, and we
So
talked
do
about.
I.
Yeah. So yeah, it's all doom and gloom from the analysts, and I understand why that is. It's because the Europeans at current state do not have capacity to make up the shortfall of the United States leaving. It leaves a big vacuum. The Europeans just don't have it right now. The Europeans could acquire that capability. We have read that it would take anywhere from like 5 to 10 years to do that. But to me, that's like, well, that's business as usual. Does this qualify as business as usual for the Europeans, or do the Europeans regard this as a national security emergency? There does seem to be some differences of opinion between and within European countries as far as this goes. I acknowledge that. But like national security, when there's a national security emergency, stuff can start to move really fast. Political barriers can fall. We can go from 2% of GDP military spending per year to 5% or to 7%. I think Russia is approaching 10%. Depending on how it's counted, right?
I think I just saw it's about 7 to 8%.
7 to 8,
yeah.
And, depending on what happens to the Russian economy, which might start shrinking, like it could actually go up from there, right? Depending on how much more fighting they need to do, how many more artillery shells they need to buy from the North Koreans, drones from Iran, and whatever else, right? European countries do have fiscal capacity. They can spend more on this stuff. They can issue debt, and they're starting to, as the European Union, right? It's national security emergency. That open up the checkbook. We're doing this, right? They've done it during the world wars. Like they did it during the Cold War. They could do that again. They do have the technical capacity. Now, I readily acknowledge that they don't have some of the advanced aerospace stuff that the Americans do yet, but they do have plenty of advanced technology. that they can supply to the Ukrainians. They can sell to the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians themselves have an expanding military industrial complex. Ukraine, during the Soviet Union, when it was part of the Soviet Union, was in fact a gigantic armory for the Soviet Union. Like, it has a ton of armaments factories, and it's innovating very rapidly when it comes to autonomous systems like drones and robotic combat. The Danes have set up a funding provision, basically where they give the Ukrainians money to buy weapons for themselves. Right.
I think, by the way, it was just announced. I have to double check this, so maybe we'll have to correct the record. But I think I just saw that the Danes are now taking something like $1 billion in Russian assets and giving it to the Ukrainians for weapons purchases.
The Europeans are sitting on, I believe, hundreds of billions of dollars of frozen Russian assets that they could turn around and spend, right? And look, this will be the Ukrainians basically buying stuff from themselves. So it's a way of just mobilizing Ukrainian society even more than it has been. I believe that the Ukrainians are spending a third of their GDP on their military now. Of course, their economy collapsed because it's under attack. But it's like, yeah.
So I have two questions for you then. Like one, so I mean, you're basically saying if there's the political will, this is a surmountable problem. So
I am saying that.
Okay. So I guess that's a bigger question, which we can save, which is, do we think there will be the political will? But the second question is, given that you think they have the technical and fiscal capacity to do this, do you think that they can accomplish it on a reasonable timeline?
That's a key question, right? Because there is potentially some kind of clock on the Ukrainians' ability to hold the line against the Russians. The Russians have been grinding forward super slow, right? I think their rate of progress in 2025 has decreased by like 80% or something. So, like, yes, they are moving forward, but it's so slow. There's 1,000 casualties a day on the Russian side. They can replace those people, but it's not nothing. It costs money. It costs public goodwill. It's not easy. They have less money than ever, right?
I wish I had the figure. I just looked at this morning, so this is what's happening to my brain. But the casualty figures and the total amount of money spent, the estimates are like very significant.
Extremely significant. And like the bang for buck on the Russian side is getting worse. It's not getting better. It's actually getting worse. Now, the Ukrainians are brittle.
Right.
What I mean by that is like, they don't have the manpower reserves. I don't know if they're completely mobilized, but like they're kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel. If there is a Russian breakthrough, then it might just shatter the lines and they could go all the way to Kyiv. That's what people are really worried about here. But
well, they've been worried about that since February 24th, 2022,
and it hasn't happened. Right. It's actually been the opposite. It's like they beat them back and then have held the line more or less. Now there is this grinding advance, but like it would take Russia, I forget, it's like 70 years or something to conquer the entirety of the country at current rates, which is like, you know, I think Russia would probably give up before.
Well, so then can I, because again, now I'm just like summarizing what I see as the prevailing analysis on the Russian side of the equation, and leaving aside what Putin's ultimate political goals are, whether he's moderated them in the last 3 years or not. And I think that's maybe an open question at this point, but
he will present maximalist demands either way.
That will, for negotiating purposes, sure. I'm just like, I don't know what like his bottom line would be right now, like what deal he would accept. But for the sake of argument, since we're talking about this, maybe continuing to grind on, which by the way, might be the best bet since that has been what has continued to happen.
Yes.
As very few of us accurately predicted 3 years ago. I'm just gonna
nice.
Give myself flowers on that.
Good work.
Look, like my understanding is the sanctions have had a real effect on the Russians. Like it has
unquestionably.
It's not as if it has not done no damage, but they have found workarounds. They have other countries that basically are now aligned with them, or at least giving them workarounds that they can sustain the damage that that's creating. They certainly have superior manpower reserve to the Ukrainians, and clearly are willing to burn through those reserves at quite staggering rates. certainly by American standards, the numbers are astronomical, which is to say they seem capable of waging this war of attrition more or less indefinitely.
Mm.
Um,
Hmm.
maybe not in call it for another 3 years. I
Hmm.
think I'm confident saying that. Is that an effort that you think the Europeans are willing to match over the long term
They
without
won't have to.
US involvement?
Right. The European economy is not in the toilet and things are not getting worse. From everything I've read, you are correct, but it's just going to get more expensive on the Russian side. Recruitment bonuses go up. They have to hire mercenaries from who knows where, right? Apparently China now. Like the Ukrainians have captured Chinese prisoners of war who are mercenaries.
Oh, I did not see that. I knew about the
Yeah.
North Koreans, but
Yeah,
yeah.
the North Koreans sent a brigade over, right?
Yeah.
Or whatever. But are they going to keep doing that? I don't know. That deployment seemed to be limited to Russian territory. Anyway, the Europeans would have to spend a lot more money.
Yeah.
But like as a result of that, the Europeans reindustrialize. There are more jobs for the Europeans to do. Unemployment is a big problem. Industrial unemployment is a big problem in Europe, especially in Germany, France, increasingly the UK. They've deindustrialized, right? Maybe this can actually solve some political problems for the Europeans too. Understanding that they're going to have to spend less on welfare, which is tricky for the Europeans. So it represents a reorientation of resources. But I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that they can't or won't do it.
I wouldn't go that far. I guess I would. Maybe we do disagree in some, by at least degree. Like, my pessimism is somewhat informed by, like, I have been hearing for years that the Europeans will finally spend more on defense, especially after the initial invasion. And that's one, by the way, I got wrong, was like, after chuckling about people saying, yeah, the Germans will finally start spending more, I was like, oh, this might actually do it. We haven't really seen that at high levels yet. But, and this is a point, we've talked about international relations theory and grand strategy in the past on the show. This is a point these so-called realists like to make a lot, which is what will really get this underway is a full US pullout, or a substantial US pullout from Europe will provide the incentive for this to happen. I guess I'm not sold on them being able to do it in a short enough period of time for it to make a major difference. I do think at current aid levels, given as we've talked about what's at stake for the Ukrainians, that you will see a simmering insurgency in Ukraine, regardless of what happens, unless there's a full-blown peace settlement that's imposed on them by both the United States and the rest of Europe.
Yeah. Let's talk about that a little bit. So the worry about the Ukrainians is they just break. The front breaks, and the Russians finally make a dash to Kyiv, and they're able to control the entire country or large parts of the country. I don't know that they would have the capacity to take over the entire country. Then it's like there's some kind of draconian imposed peace on the Ukrainians.
I don't think
And
anyone's thinking it's going to be the whole country at this point, unless, as you're saying, it's a complete collapse. But
yeah, but the Ukrainians were entirely prepared in 2022 to fight a long-term insurgency. That's what they were planning to do. It's like they had caches of weapons in the
yeah,
hills and valleys, and they were going to go underground and, basically do the French resistance things that we saw in World War II. And by the way, the Ukrainians have a long tradition of partisan warfare that the Russians are very familiar with and they are scared of, with good reason. And yeah, Ukrainians are tough. I look at them and I think about the balance of resolve, which is this idea, again, from international relations theory. Who wants it more? Right? The United States had overwhelming advantages against North Vietnam during the Vietnam War. We bombed the bejesus out of them. We killed, 1 million of them? Something like that. It was a lot.
I'd have to check, but I think it was more than that. But
More than that.
I'll have
Yeah,
to
over
check.
1 million. But they stayed in the fight. They didn't quit. No amount of punishment would make those guys quit. They wanted the entirety of Vietnam, and they got it. They outlasted us, right? I think that should the Russians, achieve whatever result is acceptable to Putin, it's going to be a tell him what he's won, Johnny situation. Congratulations. Here's a flaming bag of shit. Just constant partisan attacks, terrorism inside Russia. Like, it'll never, never settle down, right? Now, the Russians are draconian. They can do really, really nasty stuff, and they know how to control populations. But I just think, like, with the Ukrainians, they would be biting off more than they could chew. We've already seen that.
Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, it depends on how ruthless you're willing to be. And I don't think that there's any reason to think Putin isn't willing to be maximally ruthless.
Yes, he certainly is.
But yeah, if you just think about, like, look at the insurgencies the United States had to deal with in recent decades, it was a disaster.
Yeah.
I don't know if it will look exactly like that, but I do think it's going to be a big problem for them for a long period of time, unless there is a settlement that all of Europe and the United States accepts and that Putin is willing to accept. And
Right.
I think that was Trump's goal, and he was surprised. And frankly, I mean, to the point you were just making, this is why, like, I'm a little surprised Putin doesn't want to take the deal. Like,
Right.
if I were advising him purely on, like, power political grounds, I probably would say, like, what are you doing, man? Like,
Yeah.
we're getting Crimea recognized, or at least that's still a bone of contention, but I think that probably would be part of the deal.
I think so.
And this strip in the east and south of Ukraine, and you are getting international recognition, including from the United States, for it. And in exchange, you also get to end this war that has been pretty disastrous. Like, I'm a little surprised he's not more interested in it, but he seems to think time is on his side because of the U.S. pullout.
Well, whether or not he believes that time is on his side, there's probably another side to the equation, which is, what does he feel he needs to come home with to justify the outlay? And he has said the goals are the goals, and we have to satisfy the goals. We need full control of these 4 provinces, which he doesn't have, right? And may never get. It may take years to get that.
Those being Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia.
That's right. And he controls, more of some and less than others, right? He got booted out of Kherson completely 2 years ago, I believe, at this point, like across the river, right? So he needs that. He needs a pliant Ukrainian government. He needs a demilitarized Ukraine. The exact opposite is happening, and it's like, well, you have to satisfy all of those conditions. You may be fighting forever. Now, he may look at that and be like, I want to be fighting forever because I want to be in charge forever. And, fascism requires a war, basically. So let's just have this war in the state of emergency forever. Like, this makes my job easier, but, like, that's dangerous. That's dangerous. People get upset, Standard of living's going down in Russia, finally. And especially if oil prices go down, it becomes more difficult. So he's walking this very fine line.
Yeah, I do wonder how much of it does have to do, which we've talked about before, this commitment problem. How much of this has to do with his concerns about what happens after a settlement is reached. Like, what is the political orientation of Ukraine? And maybe that's still what's on his mind at the moment, because even some of the more sort of middle ground proposals, things like going back to Ukraine, basically being a neutral state, it doesn't get to be in NATO. Some people making those proposals, including, I think, Wes Mitchell, who I mentioned earlier, wrote this right after the war started, proposing a neutral Ukraine, that, like, it could still be in the EU and it could still have sort of a Taiwan type relationship with the United States, where it's still getting Western arms, but is not in NATO. Like, I don't think that's a deal that he's interested in at this moment.
Doesn't seem to be, but we wouldn't necessarily know, because he's not incentivized to, disclose where his, I guess you could call them green lines instead of red lines, right?
Well, like, as we're talking about this, because I think you've convinced me. I guess I was more. I don't never feel optimistic about international politics, so I don't want to say optimistic, but I was more willing to think that there was a chance that he might have an interest in accepting this sort of settlement that Trump appears to have floated. I think if that's not going to happen, I am of the opinion like we might still be talking about this in 2030.
Sure. And yeah, 5 years from now, there's no reason to think that Putin won't still be in charge. But again, like this is a probabilistic thing. And as the economy declines, as people continue to die, as Russia doesn't have access to external consumer goods, right? They're trying to do what the United States did during our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, I think, which was largely externalize them and have them not touch society. And we were able to do that because we're way richer. And yes, we used mercenaries too, by the way, lots of them, contractors, right? That's exactly what the Russians are doing. Like, it reminds me very much of what happened there. There was a political reaction when it wrapped up, though. And, Trump was actually a big part of that political reaction. And what we're seeing now, to a certain extent, is a revolutionary political reaction in the United States. Like, I don't think it's too far to say that the United States is undergoing revolutionary political change. Yeah, we live here, so we know. Putin does not want revolutionary political change. Yeah. So I do think there's something to the notion of like actually keeping this pot on the boil, right? But it's like, can he continue to do that? Because the costs continue to mount. And as the costs continue to mount, it may actually bring forward the break within Russia. Now that
I mean, I've seen like you're talking about like kind of a diversionary incentive to keep eyes away from domestic business. That's actually like a pretty common argument when it comes to Russia and Putin. I mean, I just don't know right now. I'm a little more skeptical of that was a cause of the invasion in the first place. I think there were much larger core political goals. But, people said that about like when he intervened in Syria in 2015, for example. I might have some more sympathy for that example. I just think right now, like to your point, I'm not sure that would even serve his own goals because at some point, as you said, people are going to start to, this is a much larger conflict, right? I'd have to check the figures, but not to minimize U.S. casualties in Iraq and Afghanistan. But I'm not going to get these exactly right, but the number of troops killed in those two conflicts combined, something like 10,000. But I don't even think it's that high. Obviously wounded more than that. The numbers on the Russian side in this war are way, like orders of magnitude beyond that.
100%. And Russians are famously tough and famously stoic. But the operative question that I'm asking myself now is the political goal seems to be the reconstitution of the Russian Empire. Putin's been fairly explicit about that. If you look at how it's being couched inside of Russia, it is, we have to protect Russians. We have to restore the Russian world, Ruski Mir, right? And that means like gaining control over Ukraine. These guys are Nazis and terrorists and drug addicts. They're on our borders and they're attacking native Russian speakers, right? So we have to put that to rights. But for the average Russian, like, how much are they willing to suffer over what period of time for the reconstitution of the Russian Empire? Versus the average Ukrainian inside Ukraine, how much are they willing to suffer for the preservation of an independent Ukraine?
How much would you, I mean, obviously, like, the Ukrainians have the highest stakes.
Resolve. Yes.
And that's important. I mean, how much do you think, because we've talked about this before, this is about reconstituting the Russian Empire? I mean, Posen, who we both know at MIT, just wrote an article saying this is actually a preventive war.
Against who?
Basically against NATO.
Okay.
That there was a window of opportunity and that the Ukrainians were getting closer and closer. This is the NATO expansion argument.
I see.
Which
to joining NATO.
Yes, which I do not dismiss at all.
Okay.
I'm not saying that's the whole story, but I think there's quite a bit of evidence to suggest that's at least part of it.
Okay.
This is why I keep going back to this commitment problem. Like, Maybe he thinks, he being Putin, like we've tried the neutral Ukraine thing already, and
Right.
like it didn't work very well. So I really need total control of the country. If that's where he's at, I think we're gonna be here for quite a while.
That's
Uh,
where he has said he is at, like basically from the beginning, and he has not moved off of those lines in any appreciable way, right?
and I guess you wouldn't expect him to right now if Trump is indicating that he's going to make things more difficult for the Ukrainians by pulling the plug.
Right.
Uh,
And it's, by the way, it's not clear that he's going to do that. I think it's more likely than not, for sure,
I'd
at this
call it
point.
75-25.
Something like that. Yeah,
Yeah.
maybe 80. But he is famously mercurial, changes his mind a
Yes,
lot. Who knows? He got mad at Putin,
he
you
did.
know?
That was an amazing social media post, all time,
Yes. 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 Vladimir, stop.
all caps.
Yes. Text stop to Vladimir to halt the war. I love that. Anyway, yeah, no, like Putin probably does believe that he has time on his side and he's like gradually satisfying his objectives. Is that a rational belief? You know, was this a rational goal? He seems to believe that he has enough control over Russian society that he can roll these dice and continue to roll them. Right?
Well, so Posen, who I think we both respect, I mean,
Very
sure,
much so.
we don't agree with everything he says, but basically, like said, as is the case with most, examples of preventive war, that he saw a closing window.
Yep.
That de facto Ukraine was growing stronger and more closely aligned with the West, and that things were not going to improve. And so the moment to act came, and he did. And I suppose we won't be able. I mean, he says in this article that he like can't prove this. He's basically relying on theory to kind of do the work for him, and I don't think we'll know for quite a while. But if that is the case, like, yeah, I think that the Russians probably will be at this for quite a while, which gets back to your
Yes.
question on like, what are the Europeans going to do? I think that is now, if we can put in the bank that the United States is getting out of this business, like that is now the key question, I would say.
I think that's right. That's the next key question, right?
Yeah.
I think we could take the continued Ukrainian participation in this war for granted because they're
Correct.
being attacked and they're not going to stop defending themselves. Like I just don't believe that because and earlier you made the point like the Europeans cannot replace air defenses for the Ukrainians. That may be true, but those are mostly like punishment strikes. And I don't think the Russians can punish Ukrainians enough to get them to stop fighting. Like, I don't think that's possible. I really don't. I think that they will take any amount of punishment because they have to. They would rather die than live under Putin, most of these people. And these people are also famously tough, by the way. They're no less tough than the Russians themselves. So, yeah, getting back to your actual point, though, what are the Europeans going to do? And how much of an emergency do they believe this to be? If they look at the performance of the Russian military against the Ukrainians, it's been piss poor, right? But the Russians are a lot more aggressive than the Europeans probably thought they were. And threat is a combination of, intent or aggressive intent and capability, right?
Yeah.
I would also say that Russia has learned a lot over the course of 3 years, and they're performing better than they were. 2022, they look like a total paper tiger. 2025, they're a real tiger. They're just getting chewed up, right? So
yeah, I mean, I'm a little out of my depth, or at least not studied up on the question of how quickly the Europeans could mobilize to be on a full war footing, if that's theoretically what we're talking about. They have actually done quite a bit. I have to check. We were talking about this before we started recording, but that they had reached roughly Cold War levels. I think it was with artillery, maybe. I'd have to check.
artillery production, yeah.
Artillery, okay. But some of these higher end systems might take longer. And it's also a political calculations because the defense contractors that would be making these systems would need assurances that this is a long-term project to make it worth their while, basically. Like these are 5 to 10 year, contracts essentially. So, but then the other question I have is the war has obviously increased the threat level to the Europeans. Like that much
Yep.
is clear. There are also European leaders who we now know who had real qualms about NATO policy with respect to Ukraine. So Angela Merkel, the former chancellor of Germany, I think she wrote it in her memoir, basically said she thought it was a bad idea to offer Ukraine, or I think it was the 2008 Bucharest summit when Ukraine was not admitted to NATO, but was basically said it's not a matter of if, but a matter of when. I think Sarkozy, the president of France, had qualms about it. So like, it's not as if they see this as totally one-sided. I think obviously the political calculations have changed since the invasion. But I don't know, even leaving aside the inefficiencies of balancing, and we're talking about a whole bunch of different countries with not identical interests, even leaving that point aside, whether even the more, let's call it hawkish element of the Europeans necessarily wants to wage this till the end and like is not interested in reaching some sort of modus vivendi with the Russians, assuming Putin never gets there, which, as we were just saying, might be a while.
The further east I go in Europe, the less likely I am to trust anything.
100%.
Anything Putin says, especially, but just Russia in general. The Poles, the Balts, the Nordics, forget it, right? There are some exceptions like the Hungarians, right? And the Serbs who are pro-Russian.
Belarus, yeah.
Yeah, Belarus is part of Russia.
Is basically, yeah.
I mean, they're part of a union state, so yeah, okay. It's been completely vassalized, no longer independent, really. So you've got that contingent, which is not nothing. You combine the Poles, the Nordics, and basically the Baltic area, right? That's a good amount of capability. The Germans, I think, are the pivot point of this whole thing. You look at what Friedrich Merz has said, the new chancellor of Germany. He is pro-military industrial complex, pro-rearmament. His situation is tenuous. We had his show about how the Alternative for Deutschland came in second, and they might come in first next time.
And he needed multiple votes to actually...
Correct.
Yes.
Which was an eye-opener. Yeah. But that was a problem on his left.
Yeah.
Not on his right. And that's, I looked at that and I was like, that's just stupid for those left-wing parties. I understand why they did it. The socialists and so on, to send a message that they don't like this level of spending. Right. But yeah, I think we have to look at German politics to really understand what's going on there. If Germany rearms, I made this point earlier, that's actually really good for East Germany because there's a lot of industry in East Germany. And to whatever extent the Alternative for Deutschland is being fueled by industrial unemployment, like a defense boom could actually change the politics there somewhat. I don't know if it will. This is all completely speculative.
Yeah, we'll have to see. I agree with you. Germany does seem to me like the key point. And if that happens, the great irony for Vladimir Putin will be that the invasion of Ukraine has resulted in what many people consider to be Russia's worst nightmare, which is German rearmament.
Totally. Yeah. And look, I think it's happening. The pace at which it's happening is variable, right? But I think Merz is moving Germany faster towards rearmament than Scholz was. I think that's empirically true. France, also very important, right? That the other two players in this are France and the UK. France and the UK are also like, France is basically hanging by a thread as far as the National Front taking over, their right-wing Eurosceptic pro-Russian party. I don't remember exactly what Le Pen's attitude.
Well, she got dinged. She got disqualified. Yeah,
I forgot that was crazy.
I forget what the scandal was, but she was, I think, ineligible now to run in the next election.
It was
okay.
misuse of election funds to do other stuff, I guess. And yeah,
Look at that. Real action on garden variety political corruption.
yeah, totally.
Yeah.
But like she has been proscribed. I don't think her party has been, and her
No.
number two will stand. Who knows, like whether that will be good or bad, right? Yeah. So France, under current leadership, has been well. France retains more capability than Germany ever did. You know, they retain some independent strike capability. For instance, they have aircraft carriers, they have nuclear weapons. Same goes with the UK. The UK has been very pro Ukraine as well. So I think, yeah, assuming that Germany goes and France goes and the UK goes and continues to support Ukraine, that's a lot of capability.
Yeah. I
You know,
mean, the question I have there then is like, in theory, and I don't think this would happen for some time for the reasons we just talked about, but in theory, if Putin agreed to the sort of deal Trump seemed to have in mind, I wonder how much resistance there would be in those countries to supporting that kind of deal.
oh, like they
I
would
think
take the deal.
I think they would take the yeah, okay. So we
They
agree.
would take the deal. The Ukrainians would take the deal. Like, you know,
You think
probably with
you think they would take the deal though if the Europeans were willing to keep backing them? That I don't think would I think the Ukrainians would only take it if they had lost all external support.
so my understanding is that Zelensky was ready to stop the conflict at current lines and give away Crimea.
Okay.
That's my understanding. He wasn't willing to disarm. I think he was willing to not join NATO.
Yeah, that was part of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So and I think the Europeans would have been fine, like not fine with it, but like yeah, they would
Gone
have
along.
supported that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Particularly if that's the American line, right? I think everybody on the Western side was like ready to do that. The Ukrainians were obviously not happy about it, but they recognized the realities and they would prefer to, you know, stop fighting. They want those territories back, but they also recognize that it's just not going to be possible militarily
Yeah.
under current conditions. Yeah.
All right.
So the next sort of line is the entirety of those four provinces that we've talked about.
Yeah.
And we had a conversation about whether the Europeans will take that deal. If the Russians were like, we will stop fighting if Ukraine disarms and changes leadership and we get the entirety of these four provinces. And we will no longer.
I don't think they're going to take it until the Russians occupy them.
Yeah. It's like, why would we give that to you, right?
Yeah. That I
Why
don't
would we
think
give that
we'll
to
have.
you?
Yeah. Now, if they're occupied, we'll have to see. But I don't think they're going to do it until the Russians are able to take it by force.
And what that means, though, is that the Europeans will try to stop the Russians from doing that. They will support the Ukrainians in protecting them. So it's a question of whether we have a race now. We have a race condition. It's the remainder of those four provinces. And like at current rates, again, it's going to take a really long time. The Russians would need a breakthrough. So now we're talking about the possibility of a breakthrough, right? And what that looks like and whether the Ukrainians can hold out.
And I can't speak to how likely that would be.
I don't know.
Yeah.
What I do know is they have crazy drones and robots now that help a lot with defense. And that's what's bogging the Russians down.
Well,
yeah.
Maybe that's a good place to leave it.
Let's leave it there. We've boiled it down.
Before we go, I do have to say apologies to Knicks fans and I do love that team. That's a hard team to not love. They're gritty. They play hard. The Halliburton thing was pretty awesome. I'm just going to say.
Yes. It's former Sacramento King. Yeah. Tyrese Halliburton with the incredible, although premature Reggie choke move.
I know. And the ball like hit the ceiling. Also,
he went straight up.
Because of that instance, I had to learn a Gen Z term, aura farming, which I had not learned before, which apparently refers to trying to be cool by like ripping off someone else's aura. And,
yes.
he said he can't do it again because otherwise that would be aura farming.
I love that. So I've learned what that is, and I'm glad that he did it because it was sick. And yeah, like I don't care about the Pacers, but and yeah, it's kind of like, you know, it's like tertiary shine back on the Kings because we drafted him, and of course let him go in a bad trade because that's what we do. But you know, it's like living a little bit vicariously.
And all right, then here's the last point I'll make, because I think sports and international politics are alike with this, which is crazy shit happens sometimes. Which the stat I heard was prior to that game in all of NBA playoff history, I think, was that a team with a 14-point lead with less than 3 minutes to go prior to that game was 977-0.
Pretty good.
But
pretty good.
You just never know.
Sometimes the flipped coin will land on its edge. That's the thing that happens. And maybe that's what Ukraine is waiting for as well, right?
We'll see. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Great sesh.
Good to see you,
Talk
man.
soon.